So here we see Jose Vasconcelos, who is the mastermind of what became the Mexican mural movement. This photograph shows him in 1914. And it's not too much later, 1920s, that he's got this mural movement underway. And I think it's really interesting to think about this moment in time when he creates this initiative, right? The Porfirio Diaz regime had been the ruling regime in Mexico for 31 years before the revolution. And then there was 10 years of revolution, civil unrest. And then now there's this moment, things have stabilized. It's the 1920s. And yet how aware of history everyone must have been with all of those events unfolding around them. And certainly the three great figures, Orozco, Siqueiros, and Rivera, were very aware that they were in this moment of historical turmoil and excitement and change, and that they wanted their art to be about making history. They were all involved in left politics, so they had this idea that history was a process of revolutionary change. They didn't all have the same kind of politics, and Orozco is very interesting because he actually said, quote, "I don't trust revolutions or glorify them since I witnessed too much butchery." So they have a range of thinking, and they also have a range of styles. So I want to analyze some elements of their styles, but what unites them is that they are all doing an epic history painting in a modernist style, some kind of hybrid of modernism and realism. They are reigniting the whole tradition of history painting for the 20th century. I mean, it was, 1840s when we were looking at history painting and before. And here, they are conscious that they are making a state-sponsored public art. So here we see Jose Orozco's murals at the National Preparatory School in Mexico City in 1926. And right away they show us that these murals are integrating the architecture of the site where they are painted with the way the composition is designed in order to create the historical narrative. And so one of the reasons these are incredibly difficult to photograph is that they are interrelated with the architecture, and murals are by definition site-specific. So you can't really understand them separate from the site, but we do our best with photographs. So if we're calling this an epic history painting, we see Orozco clearly dealing with the events of revolutionary struggle, and creating that not just through his scene of battle and bodies struggling, but also through the quality of his forms, right? He uses a kind of a cubist push and pull of space and form so that we have this sense of pressure, compression that enhances the quality of the bodies, which are kind of stylized and exaggerated in their musculature to be faceted in a cubist semi-abstract way, to be sharp, to have a sense of edges that express violence and upheaval. Siqueiros' portrait of the bourgeoisie its site is the electricians' union. In terms of his style, look at how packed, congested, and how spatially complex it is. This is the way in which this is a modernist history painting. Not just that it's telling us about modern events, the Mexico of Siqueiros' time, but that the approach to space and form is informed by cubism and by expressionism, right? So the figures have a kind of exaggerated quality. Forms are slightly distorted or distended in order to create a sense of emotional anguish and intensity. You have forms that seem to go back in space, but then there's a counter pushing forward in space. That cubist quality of multiple planes, spatial planes colliding is what energizes Siqueiros' style so much. And that energy becomes one of his dominant metaphors for modernist struggle and for the struggle to make historical change. Turning to Rivera, we are looking at the interior courtyard with the illuminated walls that Rivera painted at the Ministry of Education. So here, the site is this particular building with these arched loggias or arched passageways around a courtyard, a classicizing architecture. And the site is used for the educational officials. So, what are you going to paint if you've got this space to work with, this building, this structure with all these compartments, and you have this purpose of education? So thinking about the structure of the building, Rivera conceives of the murals here as being a kind of a history of Mexico, the recent revolution, and a celebration of the culture. And he divides them by courtyards into the court of labor and the court of the fiestas. Here in a stairwell, Rivera gives us a scene that is titled The Mechanization of the Countryside. This is in his court of labor. And so one sees the agrarian woman kneeling with the corn and the force of electricity. This is so great. This force of electricity is embodied in this kind of almost like angel of technology that's, electrifying the countryside. He's thinking about the idea of progress and the revolutionary promise of progress for the laborers. A fun thing to note is that Rivera is quoting Masaccio, a 15th century Italian Renaissance painter. With that figure, Masaccio has this very famous angel that seems to kind of project forward out of the arch to Eden and send out Adam and Eve in their expulsion. And one thing that's interesting about Rivera's style is that it is a realist style informed by the Renaissance, because he was actually funded by the Mexican government to go to Italy and study the famous Renaissance fresco murals of the Renaissance. Clear that one of the Italian Renaissance artists that Rivera loved so much was Giotto di Bondone, an artist from the 1300s who was famous for bringing Christian stories about Jesus and his followers, bringing them down to the earthy reality of ordinary people. And he was famous for his bodies, which are so pleasantly rotund, kind of solid, squat, very human, very weighty, all to make the events of Jesus and Judas here seem very much that they're happening in the world of people, ordinary people here on earth. So Rivera developed a way of forming bodies that's clearly referencing Giotto, and the idea of Giotto as the artist who brings to life the kind of emotional reality of ordinary people participating in great events. And so he has this kind of realism that's through the sort of subtle but clear modeling of forms. Everything feels very three-dimensional. And yet at the same time, he is very much influenced by Cubism. And this has to do, once again, with the space being kind of compressed and congested so that we feel sort of a kind of pushing and pulling of multiple planes, almost kinetically interacting in a very complicated fashion, a very dynamic fashion. So he had started out as a painter. Here's a self-portrait he made as a young painter. And then when he went to Europe to study in the 20s, he encounters Cubism up close, and here is his Zapatista landscape, his version of Cubism, where the faceted planes are very wittily a metaphor for kind of the hiding, the hide and seek of the warrior retreating into the mountains and coming out, a kind of a sense of spying and hiding associated with civil war that's being translated here into the Cubist idiom. It's very brilliant. And the thing that's really important to Rivera is taking these European references, whether it's to the Renaissance or Cubism, and making them actually serve indigenous culture. So what he's interested in here with this festival shown in the Festival of the Courts is the indigenous festival of the burning of the Judases, which is a pre-Easter festival of kind of cleansing evil, and the energetic participation of the crowd. Other scenes are less kind of hyperactive, but still have this sense of complex Cubist influenced space and these bodies that are so clear and so human in their weighty roundedness. Here, the distribution of the land, this is dealing with the legacy of the revolution as being an agrarian revolution, one that dealt with, in part, issues around land ownership and the use of the land. So Rivera also has a commission then to do the National Palace, another vast-scaled, multi-part commission that I can't even begin to show you the breadth of it. And whether it's the entire commission itself that's integrated in a vast architecture or the individual scene, we're dealing with a kind of a cinematic epic. And by cinematic, I mean, Rivera is thinking about film now, where we have this landscape where the Aztecs are living out their life, but in terms of the style, it's as if we're seeing a camera panning all the way back to the mountains and all the way forward to the detail of the everyday events that are going on in the glory of Aztec culture. So we have this kind of panning eye that encompasses numerous events. And so Rivera is blending elements from avant-garde art, from traditional art, from cinema, and from photography. So he gives us this very congested field of incidents that requires us as viewers to be very actively engaged in looking. We have to look up close in great detail, but then we have to actually carry our eyes back to understand the man with the whip that's forcing the labor of these men carrying the pole, the tree trunk, I mean to say. And then even more horrifying, the hanged people from the tree and back to the ships. It's a kind of an art that is encyclopedic in its scope and demands that you read very closely. It suggests that history is dense with stories that are difficult to sort out. And this is a good photograph because it helps you to understand this integration with the architecture, the grandeur of the architecture, the vast public space, and the viewing conditions of the people who come. And you see this guy kind of straining to look up. There's so much complexity packed in that kind of sucks you in and involves the viewer in this immersive experience.